Hello buddy, it's Wyvern here with another Total War Warhammer 2 tier list. And this time around we are going to be tiering the various lores of magic in the game. And this has been a tier list that was requested a while ago. It is, however, a tier list that I've really been unsure of how exactly to approach because there are just so many factors to discuss when it comes to a lore's viability. Which factions is it attached to? Which faction benefit more from it than others, or in the case of if it's exclusive to a single faction, how much does it benefit that one faction to use such a lore? What characters is it attached to? A spell such as Itza really cannot be a lore such as Itza really cannot be sort of divorced from the fact that it's exclusive to Lord Croak. You can't just take the lore in isolation because, of course, Croak is an incredibly expensive investment. And so there's a lot of factors that go into this sort of tiering. Obviously, as a result, be aware that really this is going to be a rather subjective list. We are going to go through lore passives. We are going to go through the strengths of the lore, the stronger spells, the weak spells, how exactly it synergizes with the roster, at least for the exclusive or near exclusive spells, such as lore of vampires, of course, lore of Itza, lore of wild, etc. And we're going to, of course, discuss perhaps which characters they may be attached to and all those things. But do keep in mind, this is definitely going to be a bit of a heavily subjective list. It's very hard to quantify just how useful lore can be, especially for lores that are available to multiple factions at once, since we're not simply tiering all the lores within a single faction, for example, and or even, for example, just faction-exclusive lores. And so it's definitely going to be a little bit of a toughie, but hopefully this does give you guys some idea, or at least how I see the different balances of power between different lores of magic. I will say, as you can see, there is no F tier. I do not believe any lores of magic in this game are actually bad enough to be F tier. In fact, I wasn't even sure if I wanted a D tier here, but there are some lores that I think are relatively weak or very niche, I should say, and so there will be a D tier here. But by and large, I really think the vast majority of lores are rather competitive and pretty darn good. I think most lores really could fall into the B plus category, and I assume as we do this tier list, that is where these lores will fall. However, you guys may certainly have your disagreements there. Perhaps you guys think some lores are really trashy and deserve DNF. But either way, let's dive right in. And we're going to start with the most recent added lore. And that is the lore of stealth. The lore that was added in the Shadow and the Blade DLC. Now, this is a exclusive lore to the Skaven. It is, in my opinion, a rather powerful lore of magic that is going to land in B tier, and the reason for that is because, really, the other lores for Skaven are stronger, and the lords that those lores tend to be attached to are arguably better as well. So going over lore of stealth, the passive is essentially a mini poison effect that can stack with poison. For 8 seconds, you get a minus 10% damage debuff, as well as minus 12% speed debuff. That is an excellent debuff, and combined with some of the very spammy spells in this lore, most importantly warp stars, but also the normal casted spells such as brittle bones or the armor of darkness, it can have some very powerful synergies, and you can certainly get good value as long as you're good about cycling your spells. You can get some very strong value out of this lore. Now, in my opinion, this lore is a very aggressive melee Skaven oriented lore. This is kind of a disadvantage. I would say rat rushes are not the most common strategy for Skaven. Usually a gun line or massive shooting screened by lots of bodies is, in my opinion, the Skaven way to play. And this lore doesn't bring summons, and it doesn't necessarily bring the best ways to protect your backline. So I think that holds it back a bit. As for the spells, Warp Stars, excellent spell, very cheap magic missile that can be used to chip away at single entities, can be used to chip away at enemy artillery pieces. I think it only costs 4 wounds of magic baseline, so very, very cheap spell, and it allows you to, of course, cast that passive ability relatively efficiently. Now, there are the other very strong spells, I would say, in this lore are Brittle Bones, as well as Armor of Darkness, I believe it is called. There's a lot of darkness, shadows, and black tempest and whatnot in this lore, so I apologize if I confuse some of the spells. names, but Brittle Bones, insane debuff, debuffs enemy, vigor, speed, and most importantly, minus 40 melee defense, can be incredibly useful when supporting a rat rush, whether those be, that be with plague monks, rat ogres, units like that, can make a unit very, very easy to target down, can help a Hellpit Abomination win a duel against a single entity, things like that. On the flip side, we have the Armor of Darkness. This spell grants plus 60 armor and 22% missile resist. Insanely powerful buff, especially if Overcast, you get an AoE. You can roid up your squishy units like Death Runners or Plague Monks or units like that, make them very, very resilient in comparison to their baseline stats. Keep in mind, most of those units only have about 15 armor. You soup that up, you're looking at a 400% increase in their armor value, which is just nuts. It makes them much, much beefier. Jumping from War Dancer to Saurus protection levels is really, or more than Saurus, really, is pretty darn insane. So very powerful spells there. Unfortunately, the other 3 spells in this lore are also kind of not that great. Skitter Leap is incredibly niche. Usually, one of the problems with stealthing spells in this game, or spells that can cloak your units, is the fact that, one, you can't cast these spells before a match starts, so your opponent will probably get a glance at your army anyway. They probably have an idea of where you started. Second of all, there's no guarantee that you're going to start with enough Winds of Magic to stealth your units, which is, in my opinion, really crappy. It's one of the probably worst things in Quick Match and Customs, is that you've got no way of setting your Winds of Magic levels. As a result, you've got no way of knowing if that spell will even be available right off the bat. And of course, it's kind of handily countered by like a single unit of flyers. Even though that's risky against Skaven, like a single unit of flyers can fly over and reveal your whole army, screwing you over. So that really holds Skitter Leap back. I think if there's one really bad spell in this lore, it's that one. Not because it's unusable, but because it's just very difficult to get value out of. Largely due to the game's mechanics. And really game mechanics outside of the actual battlefield, or sort of pre-battle issues. The other 2 spells in the lore are ones I'm not particularly fond of, Black Tempest, as well as the Cloak of, I believe it's Cloak of Shadows. Like I said, there's a lot of darkness and shadows in this lore. And both of them are disruptive stationary vortexes. I think that the Black Tempest is just overpriced for how much damage it does. I don't think it really tends to net value. I also don't think Cloak of Shadows is just that useful. It's kind of designed to clear out a path for a melee squad or a goon squad or something, but realistically speaking, I think you'd rather just not bring that spell and use your magic on things such as Brittle Bones or Armor of Darkness, abilities like that. But all in all, very strong lore for about 3 spells. Then the other 3 are kind of meh to bad. But definitely the Armor of Darkness, Brittle Bones, and Warp Stars, very strong. Passive is very strong for this lore. Kind of hurt by the fact that the other Skaven lores are just excellent as well. Next up, I guess if we are traveling, if we're traveling back in time here, we might as well go over to the lore of Depths. Perhaps you want to do Itza? Well, Itza's an interesting one, so we'll do Itza. Now, Itza is a very powerful damaging lore of magic, but it brings literally no utility to the field, and perhaps most importantly, it is bound to Lord Croak. Because of that, I'm going to put it at a B tier. I think it can swing certain matchups. It can be decisive. Croak can be an absolute monster in certain matchups because he can just delete hordes of infantry, delete elite cav. Allure of the Itza 3 spell can still delete a unit such as Fireborn in a single cast if you net them down. It's a really, really powerful spell. The problem is it is a lore bound to Lord Croak. You have to bring Lord Croak to get it. Lord Croak costs almost 2,000 gold, which is insane. Granted, he does bring, the greater shield of the old ones, and you do have an AoE melee attack debuff, so you can deathball with him, but still, the cost for this lore is insane. It is very niche. It does not work against monstrous infantry, really. Isn't going to help you against lords. Not really that good against shooting heavy builds, because usually the shooting will be spread out, and your chance of hitting them are relatively minuscule. Even mobile builds can kind of juke around it, because ultimately, Lore of Itza just it's a bit difficult. Maybe I'll actually drop it to C tier. It's either a very weak B tier or a rather high C tier. Despite the fact that it can, in certain matchups, such as Vampire Counts, for example, it can be an absolute brutal lore. Vampire Counts or Chaos or matchups such as that can be really strong. But otherwise, it can kind of struggle. And I think in most matchups, you're not going to want to bring this lore, and especially not Lord Croak. And I will say, as I go through these tier lists, the stronger lores in a tier are going to be more towards the left. The weaker lores in a tier are going to be more towards the right. Because I think that that way we have sort of a linear, if you're looking for a linear lineup of spells from best to worst, that way you can see them in action. Now, next up, we do have the Lore of Deeps. This is really the main reason I have the D tier here. I think this is probably the worst lore in the game right now. And yeah, it just is, in my opinion. The passive is terrible. The damage it does over time is 32, I believe. 32 damage on any cast. That's pitiful. That's not doing any real damage. Over the course of a game, you're probably not going to do more than like 150 to 200 damage to any enemy units. That's kind of pitiful for passive. It's probably one of the worst passives in the game, especially when you consider the fact that most of the strong spells in this lore, the really decent spells in this lore, are expensive casts. The cheap spammable spells or more spammable spells are kind of niche / garbage. Tide Call, a disruptive wind spell that just doesn't do a lot of damage in my opinion. It's a pretty darn weak spell. I wouldn't really bother bringing it. The Spiteful Shot is an excellent buff to your artillery. It can be great in specific matchups where you're expecting an artillery duel. Specifically Empire and High Elves, I think it can be a decent option. Perhaps against, I should say against other Vampire Coast. Maybe against Tomb Kings or against Dark Elves. It could be a decent choice. Maybe Skaven. So there's like 5 or 6 matchups where this can be a decent choice if you're looking to go with an artillery heavy build and you're looking to outshoot your opponent. But it is a very niche spell. It does one thing. It gives your artillery better accuracy. I guess it does also give magic damage, so it's good for countering like Hammer of Witches or something, but it's not that good of a spell. Then the 2 strong spells, in my opinion, in this lore are Fog of the Damned and kind of the Promethean Summon, the Rotting Promethean Summon. Even that's a bit of a stretch. Fog of the Damned is probably the strongest spell in the lore. I think it's a pretty mediocre spell, but a solid one. It grants a leadership and melee attack debuff. Nice if you're looking for a quick charge. If you're bringing Claustra, which is probably the reason you're bringing this lore, because you want it to bring Claustra to the field. So if you're bringing Claustra, then Fog of the Damned is great, especially combined with Song of Enthrallment. You debuff enemies a whole bunch. You're able to just overrun them, tank their leadership, break a line very, very quickly. So it can be a strong spell for that reason. I think Fog of the Damned is a pretty strong spell. The Promethean Summon, decent for disrupting. At this point, though, probably a bit overpriced. It is an expensive spell to cast, unfortunately. And due to the relatively short duration on Prometheans, it's going to be tough to net yourself value out of it. I definitely don't think it's as strong as it used to be. Besides that, we do have the Kraken's Pull as well as the Vangeist's Revenge. Both of these are kind of weak spells, in my opinion. Vangeist's Revenge is kind of like Wind of Death. It's a spell that potentially can do a lot of damage, but in reality, you're probably not going to get that much value. It's probably going to miss because your opponent's going to see it coming. He's going to see a pirate ship. That looks awesome, by the way. It's one of the best looking spells in the game. But a big old pirate ship popping out of the water and looking to gun him down. Your opponent's probably not sticking around to get gunned down, so your odds of getting value out of that are limited. Kraken's Pull does some damage, snares enemies by 48%. The problem is if you're looking to snare Vampire Coast, you are much better off just bring more zombies, bring summons from Lore Vampires, and then you're golden. Really trying to snare someone with an AoE Vortex, like, granted, it's immobile, it's stationary, but it's just a very unreliable snare. It's only a 48% slow to boot, so it's not going to just stop your opponent from getting through. Definitely not the way body blocking zombies can stop an opponent from getting through. So it's just a kind of weak spell there, and takes timing and all that, so it's kind of an issue. All in all, I think this is probably the weakest lore in the game. Really, there's only 3 spells in there I'd consider decent. Rotting Promethean Summon, the Spiteful Shot, and the only really good one I'd consider is Fog of the Damned. But in general, unless you're doing a niche build or you're trying to run Claustra, I don't think this is a worthwhile lore of Magic. I think it's definitely one of the weaker ones in the game. Continuing onward, we do have I guess we're just kind of going through the let's do something that's not exclusive. Lore of Beasts. Now, this is a decent lore. It's been in a few spots over the years. It's been in a strong lore at times. It's been a kind of meh lore at times. I feel that generally Lore of Beasts has been a pretty average-ish lore. but I do think that nowadays it's probably a low A to a high B. It's a very respectable lore of Magic. Once again, though, like I think I'm going to put it in B tier because it's a lore that's a little bit like the lore of Stealth. I think I will put it a little higher because I think it can bring more value to certain factions. But here's my reasoning. The passive is solid. It just gives you more Winds of Magic when you cast. You can't complain about that. That's just decent. That's good. The actual spells tend to be pretty meh. The only big game changers, in my opinion, are Amber Spear, if you can get a good one. The problem is that Amber Spear is very buggy. It tends to, and this is true for all magic missiles, but if you want to use a Amber Spear correctly, you have to bring it on a horse or foot-mounted character, really a horse character, and to get max value out of Amber Spear. And then Amber Spear tends to have line of sight issues, bugginess, and it's just can be so crappy to work with. So Amber Spear, brutal spell, but brutal to use, brutal results if you get a nice shot. So potentially a very powerful spell there. The Manticore Summon, of course, is really the defining spell of this lore. Very, very powerful there. Can really disrupt enemy backlines, can provide that terror on demand, can be a very strong ability. You do, of course, have Flock of Doom, which is just a decent damage spell. It's not as powerful as it used to be, in my opinion, but still a solid enough lore, still a solid enough ability that can just dish out the hurt to a big blob of infantry. If you're fighting Skaven, for example, or you're fighting vampire counts or something like that, need to lead a bunch of trash quickly, it can help you a lot. Because it's a fairly cheap and spammable spell, especially when combined with the passive on the lore, and can dish out some AoE hurt. That's just reliable because it's direct damage. The other spells, kind of meh. Curse of Honoraire is an AoE debuff. I basically never seen this one used outside of the bound version on the Sisters of the Thorn. It's a very expensive debuff, and most of its aspects are kind of niche. It reduces speed, and it reduces enemy accuracy on top of a melee attack debuff. So speed and accuracy debuffs are kind of limited in viability, and as a result, I think it's not that great of a spell. It's also a very expensive spell, so that hurts it too. Then there's Wissen's Wild Form, as well as Pan's Impenetrable Belt. These can have some niche applications. They can be used in sort of rush builds, and they can get some value. They're also cheap and spammable, especially especially Wissen's Wild Form. But unfortunately, Wissen's Wild Form only affects non-AP units, so that's certainly a limiting factor, or the damage component of it only affects non-AP units. The armor affects everybody, but armor's... Well, when you only get 30 armor, it's not that critical, in my opinion. So I think all in all, it's several decent spells in there. I think the only weakling spell, you know what, I'm going to move Beast to A now that I think about it. Because I think the only really weak spell in there is probably Curse of Honoraire, at least for the cost. And Pan's Impenetrable Belt is a little iffy, but I think all in all, this lore does have a better variety of useful spells than lore of Stealth. So I think a low A is probably fair. Now, moving on to... Let's go with Lore of Wilds. Now, this is the Beastmen Lord of Magic. This one is certainly a bit lower on the list. I think I would put it probably at a B tier. Not as bad of a lore as I think some people make it out to be. It has good versatility. There's really two ways you can approach this lore. You can either go for sort of big power plays with Sigor summons, which are still powerful if you just summon them in the middle of an enemy formation. You don't really want to use them for the rock throwing ability the way you would back in the day, because they don't last long enough to get a lot of rocks off and really net their value most of the time. But Sigor summon is still pretty darn potent. Mantle of Gorok is a niche, powerful point buff. It buffs melee attack by 40, I believe, plus 50% weapon strength. Just mulches enemies. It's basically like a combination of Here We Go and Occam's Mind Razor on a single unit. And granted, it costs the unit 30 armor, but who really gives a crap? It's one of the few spells that actually includes a debuff as well as a buff. But drop it on like Minotaurs with shields, or really any Minotaurs, and they will just go to Pound Town on their target and destroy it very, very quickly. It is a brutal, brutal, brutal spell. Very, very powerful. The passive on the lore is excellent, in my opinion. It's a passive vigor, speed, and charge bonus buff. Really, the main point here is the vigor buff. And this synergizes very well with Vile Tide and Brave Scream. You can spam these spells to keep your army's vigor up. Vile Tide is kind of like Awakening of the Wood. Does a little bit of damage, especially to non-armored units. Can explodes and disrupts, and just a solid spell in my opinion. Brave Scream, decent against armored infantry. Not the most amazing damage dealer, but it does some work, and most importantly will help keep your units in a minty fresh condition. So I think that's pretty solid. Devolve and Traderkin are both in a bit of an oddball spot. I think I really should say Mantle of Gorok. Those three spells are in a bit of an oddball spot. I do think that they are potentially powerful. I don't think you want to bring both Devolve and Traderkin at the same time. Usually you want one or the other. Devolve is more oriented at infantry blobs. It's kind of like a super Flock of Doom with a leadership debuff. Traderkin, speed debuff, more designed to kill off cavalry mobs. Really, my personal preference here is Devolve. I've never really liked Traderkin all that much, but I do think both have a bit of a niche application. And I think Lore of the Wild is a very solid lore of mess spells. There are no standout excellent spells in my opinion the way you get with Lore of Stealth, but I think every spell in there is viable and decent, and they synergize rather well with the lore passive, or at least there is some good synergy there with the lore passive. So definitely I think a solid B tier, probably a little higher than Lore of Stealth. Now, continuing onward, we do have the Lore of Vampires. Well, this one's an easy A. Still a powerhouse lore to this day, despite repeated nerfs and getting cussed with the nerf bat to the point that the lore should basically be dead or undead. But really, the lore it's still very, very strong. It really hinges on a handful of spells. Now, the passive is great. It's a map-wide heal. I believe it still also applies the resurrection effect that other vampire count heals do, so it's excellent right there. Synergizes really well, obviously, with your cheaper spammable spells such as Zombie Summons and Invocation of the Heck. Obviously, the Zombie Summons and Invocation of the Heck are the two meta spells in this lore. A stupidly powerful heal that, granted, is hindered by the fact that you can only hit 4 units at once, but still. And of course, summons have been nerfed, but they are still such powerful interference spells and such powerful buffs. Van Hell's Dance Macabre, an excellent AoE melee attack and speed buff. It can really make some of the mediocre vampire count units especially, but even vampire coast units, shine in close quarters where they normally wouldn't. A really powerful buff there. You do have the Gaze of Nagash, which is a pretty crap spell, I won't lie. Can be used for some niche lord sniping, especially if you're trying to snipe out a squishy caster. Like, for example, you bring Ethereals against Dark Elves. You can use Gaze of Nagash to snipe out the caster real quick if it's a squishy one, such as Sorceress or Marathi, and then free up the opportunity for your ethereal units to do a lot of work. So Gaze of Nagash does have some niche applications, but definitely on the weaker end. Curse of Years, pretty strong debuff, can be used to negate, for example, Wah or something. Definitely not bad, though not perhaps the most impressive spell. Once again, a bit expensive like Curse of Honoraire, but a workable spell nonetheless. Wind of Death is really more there for the threat factor. You can really threaten an enemy's line, prevent them from just blobbing too hard or really creating a line of doom too much. Can help break up, for example, high elf formations and things such as that. Even though I'm not particularly fond of the spell because good players will often dodge, it is still a very powerful force in the battlefield. And I think really for the passive, Van Hell's Dance Macabre, Summons, and the Invocation of the Heck alone, this lore lands itself a wonderful A tier. It's not S tier like it used to be in my opinion, but it was very rare that you will see a vampire build without this lore. It's just an excellent lore to choose from, and easily that's an A in my opinion. Well, into Lore of Shadows, this used to be kind of the run-of-the-mill mediocre lore that wasn't terrible at anything, wasn't great at anything. It kind of still is, and I think it's still a respectable lore, in all honesty. Still doesn't really bring any... I shouldn't say that. It does bring Enfeebling Foe, which is a solid one. I think it's in a very tight competition with Lore of Beasts for this sort of lower A, higher B position. I'm going to put Lore of Shadows... I think I'll put Lore of Shadows a bit higher, because I think Lore of Shadows has more varied applications than Lore of Beasts does. But I do think both lores are pretty comparable. The passive for Lore of Shadows is, in my opinion, one of the weaker ones in the game. Smoke and Mirrors grants a 12% speed boost map wide. It synergizes well with Melkos Miasma if you're trying to catch a Skirmish Cav, for example. So, for example, if you're Vampire Counts and you want your Shield Guys to catch a Skirmish Cav, it's a nice passive, don't get me wrong. But it's not that great. It's just a very niche passive. Now, as for the spells, Melkoth's Miasma, great single target damage spell, plus snare, slows a little bit. Not bad. Enfeebling Foe, an excellent single target debuff, allows your units to really mulch a specific target. It's great for Lord sniping, great for preventing a key unit from doing too much damage to your Lord, things such as that. Penumbral Pendulum, very good against formations, especially if lower end squishier troops can really disrupt, do a lot of hurt. The Withering, minus 30 armor, minus 8 leadership, solid enough debuff, can make non-AP units perform a little better, can help break a line a little faster. Just a decent spell. Not amazing, but decent enough. The Pit of Shades, not a huge fan of that one nowadays. It's just doesn't... Blobbing, perhaps it's just me, but I feel that death balls are not as common as they used to be, at least in some matchups. And the Pit of Shades is really just designed to punish blobbing hard. It also used to be one of the only decent damage spells, whereas nowadays there's more good damage spells out there. But Pit of Shades, in my opinion, not really that great. Definitely probably the weakest spell in this lore, but can still punish a blob reasonably well. It can still net you some good value, still disrupt the backline because it does throw units around, and it is of course stationary and consistent, which is great. Finally, of course, Occam's Mind Razor, excellent damage spell, gives your units magic damage, which can be critical if you're fighting a physically resistant unit. For example, Dark Elf or Dragon Princes, you can get an Occam's Mind Razor and do boatloads of damage. It is a very, very powerful passive. Or I should say, not passive, very powerful spell there. 50% damage, magic damage. Just very, very nice in specific matchups. Good against Bretonnia as well, because they tend to have magic, physically resistant units. So, definitely has some potential. I don't think it's an amazing lore, but I think that literally every spell in here is decent. Even Pit of Shades is an okay spell. The passive is meh. Not the worst of the bunch by far, but not the greatest. So I think it's solid A. It's a decent enough lore. Skaven Lore of Ruin. Now this is a really darn good one. I'm probably going to put it at S tier. Some of the characters it comes with are excellent. Of course, Ikit. Actually, for that matter, basically most of the characters this lore comes with are excellent. Grayseer, very good. Ikit, very good. Budget Ikit, or the Warlock engine, the Warlock Lord option are, I forget what it's not the Warlock Engineer, because the Warlock Engineer is the hero, but either way, all of them rather solid choices. I don't think the Warlock Lord is really that good, just because Ikit is so strong, but Ikit, Grayseer, Warlock Engineer especially, just excellent Lord and hero choices. The lore has an anti-air snare, which is excellent, really, really helps control flyers, which Skaven otherwise struggle with. Death Frenzy is a really good AoE buff. It grants immunity to psychology, which is good for keeping Skaven from routing in critical situations. The lore, if it's on a Grayseer, you do get a summon, I should note, but the lore traditionally does not get a summon. Weirdly enough, maybe, you know what? I really like this lore, but at the same time, maybe it's going to be a high A. I think I'll put it... Because the fact is that while, yes, there are these excellent spells, I will say, I think that it's going to be a high A. So here's my reasoning, and I was going to say S tier, but now that I give it a little sort of second guessing, fact is there are some kind of weaker spells in here. Scorch, not the greatest. Crack Skull especially, not the greatest. It's really all about the Warp Gale, the passive, which debuffs enemy leadership and melee attack. Warp Lightning, of course, which is a great AoE bombardment spell. And then Warp Gale. Howling Warp Gale is just really, really strong. But I think that the lore is kind of like Lore of Vampires, where it has a strong passive, has these 3 spells that are very, very powerful, but then the other spells in the lore are just not that good. Flensing Ruin is the new spell that replaced Skitterleap in this lore. It's one I haven't used a huge amount, admittedly, but I haven't felt it's that good either, though perhaps someone would correct me and tell me I'm wrong. Perhaps I've just been using it wrong. But Flensing Ruin, in my opinion, is not that good. But the lore is definitely very, very, very strong. That said, the other Skaven lore, Plague, this one is definitely an S tier. And the reason for that is because it basically doesn't have a bad spell. The passive is excellent. It is a vigor debuff, speed debuff. Added up over the course of a game, it can cripple your opponent and give you a massive vigor edge. Rat Summons, great for backline defense. Plague Monk Summons, great for backline defense. Also great for backline harass or flanking an opponent. Getting a beefy rear charge with a horde of Plague Monks can be devastating to an enemy line. So, 2 great summons. Pestilent Breath, excellent against lightly armored units. Just deletes them. It's like a wind blast. It destroys high elf archers, these cheap budget Norscan units you'll see sometimes, or Chaos Marauder units. Units like that, Beastmen units, just get smushed by Pestilent Breath. So that is a very powerful spell. Wither is amazing. Minus 60 armor in an AoE. That is what Lord of Metal wishes it had. It is an amazing, amazing debuff. It allows you to take Plague Monks or Stormvermin and just demolish an armored front line. You can drop, if you combine Weeping Blade with Wither, you can drop Chosen to 0 armor, Ironbreakers to 0 armor. It is insane, or near 0 armor, I think. It is insane what this lore can do against enemy armor with Wither. It's not Weeping Blades. Gosh darn it! But there you can. But you, wow, my mind completely slipping here. But you can. Blessed with Filth. There we go. I knew it was something with Filth, but it was slipping up there. Blessed with Filth. Excellent spell. Grants your units poison. Weirdly enough, Skaven don't actually have that much access to poison in their roster, so very powerful buff potentially. Makes your units very, very good at well, it lets them debuff enemies, survive better. Also lets you slow and snare enemies. So pestilent. So the Blessed with Filth, excellent spell. Plague is the only subpar spell in this lore, and even that's a decent one. It does decent amounts of damage over time. It is not a weak spell by any means. It's just that compared to the other 5 spells in this lore, it is not looking that hot. But really, Lore of Plague is probably, it might very well be the best lore in the game. It is an insanely powerful lore of magic, and it probably is, in just how, and if one were just to line up how many strong spells are in there, it is probably the best lore of magic in the game. Easy S tier. And I think it stands head and shoulders above everything else. Now going towards something a little more meh, Lore of Nekara. Another bog average lore, in my opinion. Not great, not terrible. Probably a low A, maybe a high B. I do think it deserves a low A because I think it's got a little more synergy and a little more benefits than Lore of Wild does, or Lore of Stealth does. I think there's, or does it? No, we'll give it a high B. I'll give Lore of Nekara a high B. Here's my reasoning, guys. Passive is excellent for Skelly Mob, so if you're looking to do an infantry build, it is great. The problem is that Tomb Kings aren't always looking to do infantry heavy builds, in which case it kind of falls off, because it's not healing your constructs, it's not helping them in any meaningful way. Or it really isn't helping them at all. The cheap spells in this lore are great for sustaining the passive. Of course, the Wrath of the Neru's Incantation of Protection, Jav's Incantation of Cursed Blades, Tross Incantation of, I believe it's, I forget what it is, Range Smiting or something, or Smiting maybe. But those 3 spells, relatively cheap, relatively spammable, all give very solid benefits. Neru's Incantation of Protection, 44% physical resist on a given target. Excellent. Helps keep your lords alive, helps keep your critical units alive in key times. Plus, of course, allows you to spam your passive because it's dirt cheap. It's like 4 ones of magic. The Jav's Incantation of Cursed Blades, when overcast, grants a bonus versus large. This is really the spell that makes units such as Nekara and Horseman so much better than one would expect based on raw stats. Very, very solid ability there. Then we do have the Tra's Incantation of Smiting. I believe it's Smiting, and I apologize if I'm wrong here. I know it's Tra's something, but it's a ranged attack buff. It can buff up your Shopti Greatbows especially, or a Bone Giant, make them do a bit more damage, make them snipe characters or models or units a bit more effectively. Can help their reload speed, make them shoot a bit faster, and just really lay the smackdown onto your opponents. So a very, very powerful ability, but a bit niche, obviously. As for the 3 powerful spells in the lore, that's where we get a little bit iffy. I think the Usurian's Incantation of Vengeance, bit of a meh one. It slows enemies and does direct damage. But in my opinion, it's just too expensive for what it does. The damage it does is not that impressive, and 24% slow is not going to be winning you any contest. It's kind of like a stronger Melkoth Miasma, but if Melkoth Miasma cost you double, or maybe it's even, I forget if it's double or triple to win some magic, then you probably wouldn't like it as much, even if it did more damage. And so it really holds Usirion's Incantation of Vengeance back. The Usef's Incantation of Desiccation, very powerful, AoE enfeebling foe essentially, but a very expensive spell, which means it doesn't synergize very well with the passive, of course. And I also find that with Tomb Kings, you often aren't worried about these about getting these sort of AoE debuffs, especially the enemy melee defense. Really what you more need is just melee attack debuffs, because your infantry, which is fighting on a wider frontage, probably is not getting as much benefit from this, and your single target, your units that are blobbed up, probably your monsters, or perhaps your chariots, are probably focusing on a single target at a time, at which point an AoE debuff is not that strong. So you'd probably get more benefit out of an enfeebling foe. I still think the Incantation of Desiccation is strong, but I think it's not as powerful as one would think. For a faction such as Empire, for example, it would probably be a stronger spell. Finally, we do have Sakhmet's Incantation of the Skullstorm. Kind of a weak vortex. Can disrupt, can do damage to squishy units, sure. But are you really going to want to bring it compared to the cheaper spells in the lore? Probably not. I don't really think it's a worthwhile vortex most of the time. It is, I guess, relatively cheap and spammable by vortex standards, but very unreliable, as most vortexes are, and definitely doesn't do as much damage as one would hope. So I think that for that reason, Nekara lends itself a solid B tier. Not amazing, not bad. Lore of Metal. This one, I like Lore of Metal, but I really like it for one specific spell, Plague of Rust. I think Lore of Metal probably lends itself a low B. Part of the problem with Lore of Metal, I shouldn't say it's just one. I like Searing Doom as well, but Lore of Metal I think nets itself a B. The passive, kind of weak, kind of hard to spam, because Searing Doom and, well, Plague of Rust is very hard to spam. It has a very long cooldown, so you can't spam it very often. And Searing Doom is not always the most spammable. You really want to use it against squishy missile units or squishy units in general, and you don't always see those on the battlefield, so a bit of a limiting factor there. Sure, 12% more weapon strength is nice, but not that amazing. The Gehenna's Golden Hounds, kind of a crappy vortex. They bounce around and tend to whiff, of course. Classic vortex issues. I'll move it. I think I'll move the lore up. I'll move it up to like a mid B. But Final Transmutation, very strong spell, of course. Can really delete a blob of enemy cavalry, blob of enemy lords or heroes. Can really dissuade your opponent from blobbing their heroes and characters too much. So very strong in that sense. Can net some significant kill counts, but a very expensive spell. Can potentially burn you in a long game if you try to focus solely on Final Transmutation and don't bring some supporting spells. The Transmutation of Lead is strong, but kind of an expensive spell for a melee attack debuff. It doesn't debuff enemy AP damage, so it's actually kind of a downside there. If it debuffed enemy AP damage, I'd see it as a more decent option, but because it doesn't, it's only minus 25% weapon strength. Not all, kind of niche. And in many situations where you really would want to reduce your enemy weapon strength, it's against AP units. Especially for the factions that get Lore of Metal. Factions such as, especially Empire or Chaos, for example, often have some very heavily armored units that are getting countered by AP. So if you could debuff enemy AP damage, that would be nice, but Transmutation of Lead doesn't do that. And finally, the Glittering Robe, a very niche spell, grants plus 60 armor in an AoE if you overcast, which is strong, don't get me wrong, but very niche. You're once again assuming that your opponent didn't bring a lot of AP troops, and while you can soup your troops up through the roof to get some insane value, for example, out of Norscan Berserkers, or buff your Empire State troops to hold the line a lot better, it is ultimately a spell that's kind of niche. If your opponent brought AP, it doesn't net that much value. So Lore of Metal is a solid B in my opinion. The Lore of the Lilwa, a bit of a lower end lore. I shouldn't say lower end lore. Lower A end lore. Maybe actually a mid A. I think I'll put it at a mid A, because you're almost never going to not see this. You're almost always going to see this lore in a Skaven, or in Greenskin armies. Well, I'm insulting Greenskins there. The passive, not that great. Sneaky stealing, cycling. You have to cycle your spells to keep this effect going, to debuff your enemies' wounds of magic regen. Realistically speaking, you're not going to net much value out of it. If you're playing Warhammer 1, it was great because it was just a constant passive. Just, your opponent had less wounds of magic unless your Goblin Sorcerer died. But in Warhammer 2, that's not the case. So cycling your spells to get max value out of this passive is just tough. And I'd say the passive is pretty bad. The actual spells, though, very strong. I think 4 out of 6 of the spells in this lore are rather powerful. None of them are sort of amazingly strong, but Sneaky Stabbing, great single target AP damage, and melee attack buff helps your units hit more consistently and dish out more hurt. Of course, Itchy Nuisance helps debuff enemies, helps keep your line alive a bit longer. Greenskins are not famous for their high melee defense, so having something to compensate for that is very nice. Gorkle Fix It is an amazing spell, one of the best snares in the game. AoE, cheap AoE 48%, slow, and charge bonus debuff, or not charge bonus, but charge speed debuff. Is one of the keys for Greenskins controlling the speed game and keeping your opponent pinned in place and in a position where Grimgore or spiders or boar boys or whatever can beat the snot out of them in close quarters. So Gorkle Fix It, excellent spell. And Vindictive Glare, of course, very strong against squishy enemy characters. Despite the nerfs it's received, it is still a very powerful spell. Do not underestimate it. The 2 weaker spells in this lore are, of course, the Curse of the Bad Moon, which is it's the moving goblin head, or it's the moving orc head or squig head or whatever it is, that moves around, debuffs enemy melee attack, melee defense, armor. I forget, there's 3 debuffs applied to it, and I forget what the last one is. I think it's accuracy, probably. But the main thing is the debuffs enemy melee defense and armor. This potentially has some good synergy with orcs, because while it is a vortex, orcs don't care about their own melee defense usually. Their defense is armor and HP pools. And so usually, the fact that you drop enemy melee defense can be helpful for units such as Black Orcs, for example. But actually getting it's a pretty expensive spell, and getting a good cast of it is just kind of unlikely. It's a vortex. It'll wander off. Debuffing one single unit while debuffing your own unit in all likelihood, just to get this effect off, is very, very iffy, and it just makes it difficult to recommend that spell. And of course, the crap, I forget what it's called. I think it was renamed actually. The stealth spell in this lore. It has some niche applications. Once again, like Skitter Leap, you can use it to stealth a blob of troops. The problem is, once again, you don't know if you'll have enough wounds of magic to use it. Your opponent is likely to see you beforehand anyway. And all that stuff. And it just really hurts the spell, in my opinion. Perhaps if the game mechanics in Quick Match were changed, this spell would actually be a decent spell. And they could actually be pretty competitive. But as that is not the case, well, too bad. Next up, we do have the Lore of Light, and this used to be probably an easy S tier lore just because net used to be so insane. Nowadays, though, it is probably a mid to low A. Certainly nowhere near the king tier levels it used to be at. Obviously, Net of Mintog is still very strong. Frost Protection is still very powerful. I think I'm going to put it at a low A. The reason being is that this lore has a lot of downsides. The passive is not that strong. It does grant immunity psychology, but to get it consistently, you have to be cycling your spells or timing your spells very well. That's tough and unlikely in a real game scenario. Frost Protection, excellent melee defense and armor buff. Cheap, spammable, good spell for sure. Net of Mintok, excellent spell. Barona's Time Warp, excellent speed and attack buff. So those are all the 3 really strong spells in this lore. All kind of price. Well, both Net and Barona's Time Warp are pretty expensive ones of magic wise. Frost Protection, not so much, but a very powerful spell. The problem is the other spells in this lore are not that great. The Shem's Burning Gaze is kind of trash. It just doesn't do that much damage, and it's just too expensive for what it provides. The Light of Battle is just garbage. It grants a unit Unbreakable. The problem is that you have to time it before a unit routes, and it's not going to rally a unit that's retreating. It's very hard to specifically micro the spell to get value out of it. You've got no real guarantee that you'll get value out of it, and I'm just not very fond of that spell. It just if you cast it too soon, then it just gets wasted. If you cast it too late, your units are already routing. Just kind of a garbage spell in my opinion. If it canceled units routing, I think it would probably be a good spell and perhaps push this lore up higher, up towards like a high A tier. But yeah, definitely holds it back. And of course, the banishment is, well, a very strong vortex, also an expensive, and it's a vortex, so it's unreliable as all hell. So that pushes light down towards the low A in my mind. Lore of Life, definitely a solid one. I'm sure some people here are screaming S tier, but honestly, alongside, I already put Vampires at A. I'm going to put Life down at A as well. Probably close competition with Lore of Ruin. Great heal with Regrowth, great heal with Earthblood. Awakening the Wood is a decent damage spell, though not amazing. But it does also grant a snare, which is nice. The passive on the lore, of course, is great because it's a map-wide heal, which is really, really nice. Dwellers Below is still kind of a strong spell. If you can get a good cast of it, it can still melt enemy elites. The problem is landing a good Dwellers Below is very tough, and because of that, I think it's not that great of a spell. Flesh to Stone, kind of weak because it's single target, and the Overcast just extends duration, which is not really what you want. You'd prefer, and I think most people would prefer an AoE. And it costs more Winds of Magic than the Lore of Metal's Glittering Robe if single cast. It's actually 1 more Winds of Magic, despite providing the same effect, which is kind of a weird inconsistency there. Or I guess it kind of makes sense. Lore of Metal is supposed to be the armor lore, but just kind of annoying having to pay 1 more Winds of Magic for the same effect. And then, of course, Shield of Thorns is a nice physical resist and weapon strength buff. So that's a decent improvement for sure. Really, the main reason you bring this lore is Earthblood and Regrowth, and the passive, just to spam heals. But I think the other spells are all decent or workable in this lore. I don't think any of them are sort of supremely exceptional, besides those 2 heals. But I think the 2 heals really prop this lore up. And arguably, this lore, you know what? This lore might even be better. It's a very close. I'd say like a tie with Lore of Vampires, because while Lore of Vampires has 3 really strong spells and Lore of Life only has 2 really strong spells, I think Lore of Life has more decent spells than Vampires does. But both of themselves net an A. Lore of High Magic is going to be oof. On one hand, I want to give this a high C. On the other, I'm thinking like a mid B. High C or like a lowish B. It's a tough one. High Magic is not a terrible lore, but it is a very niche and maybe it's a very niche lore. I think I'm going to give it a mid B. The reason is this. The passive is amazing. 11% ward save, even if for only, I think it's 10 seconds or 9 seconds, something like that. Very short duration, but it is 11% ward save, is excellent. There are some great spammy spells in this lore, especially Hand of Glory, as well as Apotheosis, which is a heal and a melee attack buff. Hand of Glory is a melee attack and reload speed buff. Apotheosis is a heal. So 2 very strong spammy spells there. Soul Quench, not a great magic missile. Definitely the weak link in this lore, in my opinion. The 3 expensive spells in this build, the Arcane Unforging, the Fiery Convocation, and Tempest are all very, very niche. They are all strong spells and arguably could push this lore up into like a low A even. And I'm kind of tempted to put it in the low A because those spells are... It's tough. I started with saying this, this lore might get a C. Now I'm pushing it towards an A. This lore just has a huge amount of versatility. Oh, it's a tough one for me. We're gonna give it a low A. So, wow, I've like completely, this one I flip flopped a whole bunch on, and I was really concerned about this one before because really, Lore of High Magic has 5 decent spells. None of the spells in High Magic I think are amazing. Arcane Unforging is generally not a great spell, but if you want to deny an opponent an ability such as Wah, it is amazing. Or if you want to delay an ability, such as the Fey Enchantress, you want to prevent her from healing knights early into a cavalry fight, something like that. It can be a very powerful debuff. Apotheosis is not the greatest heal, but it is a decent heal. Hand of Glory is not the greatest single target buff, but it is a decent buff. The passive in this lore is excellent. Tempest is useless if your opponent does not bring flyers, but if they bring flyers, it is an amazing tool to have. The Fiery Convocation is only really good against infantry, but it is very darn good against infantry. So this lore definitely waffling between like a low A and a high B. I'm not going to waffle over it too much longer. It's just a very decent lore. Where even Shadows, other sort of decent lores, in my opinion, like Shadows or Beasts, have these exceptional spells. I don't think High really has like a super exceptional spell, but it's just a very all-around decent lore. Heavens, this one's like lore of metal, I think. I'll give it a mid B, I think. Passive is not great, but in specific niche matchups against Bretonnia or against High Elves especially, it can net some major value because it's a huge melee defense debuff to flyers. In general, not great, but a decent, or workable, I should say, passive in specific instances. The spells in this lore, actually I might push it down to low B, maybe even high C, but the spells in this lore, you've got Wind Blast, which is amazing, because it just deletes squishy units, and it can even mess up armored ones. You've got the Curse of the Midnight Wind, which is a great AoE melee attack and armor debuff. Can really help your troops survive for a longer period of time, can help your troops stick around, can help your non-AP units do some extra damage. And of course, you do have the Harmonic Convergence, which is an excellent melee attack and defense buff to a specific target. It's not as good as, in my opinion, a single target debuff, like Enfeebling Foe, but it is a strong spell. The main problem with this lore is that the 3 damage spells are kind of crap. Chain Lightning, Comet of Cassandora, and Uranus Thunderbolt are just not worth it. Simply put, the spells are just not that good. It's very hard to land them correctly, or your opponent is likely to dodge, and what damage they do deal is just not that good most of the time. Unless your opponent gives you like a perfect blob, the odds of you getting value out of those 3 damage spells are very low, and for that they're going to net a low B. I think that's probably fair, because Stealth has 3 kind of meh or crappy spells, but it has a better passive than Lore of Heavens, so that compensates. Lore of Fire, this is a really good lore, of course. This one is definitely jumping up towards a high A tier. Might even be better than... I'm actually going to put it above the 2 healing lores. And the reason for that is because I think it brings more... ultimately brings more versatility to the field. The passive is excellent. Kindle Flame makes your damage spells, which are already strong, do even more damage. Very, very strong. The spells in this lore are almost all good. The only exception to that, in my opinion, is Flamestorm, and I've even heard people contest that claim. I've heard people say Flamestorm is viable, so I could even be wrong there. I've never had that much success with it. I kind of hate Vortexes, but I think that's the one weak link. Otherwise, Cascading Firecloak is a excellent melee defense and weapon strength buff. Can really help a single target stick around, do more damage. Can help your Shaggets or your Demigryphs or whatever do more work. Flaming Sword of Ruin is insanely good if you're expecting ethereals or enemy physical resist. Really, in my opinion, a bit of an underrated spell. Nowadays, it grants more weapon strength than it used to. It grants 30%, where it used to be 25%. Can buff your ranged units to do magic damage. Just such a strong spell. Flaming Sword of Ruin, really, really nice to use. Really, really nice to have in your kit. If you have Lore of Fire, you have one of the only lores that can imbue magic damage, and it can imbue it to shooting units as well. So strong in matchups where you might face ethereals. The Fireball, of course, is an amazing spell. I completely skipped over Fireball. With the Kindle Flame, Fireball can delete artillery pieces in a single Fireball. It can snipe enemy lords, especially squishy lords will just die to Fireball very, very quickly. It's brutal what Fireball can do. And you can actually use it like an Amber Spear if you brought your caster on foot and get these juicy flank shots to destroy enemy infantry. Not as well as Amber Spear, but kind of close. Of course, the Burning Head is great for deleting squishy infantry. And then the Piercing Bolts of Burning are just amazing against any blobs, or if your opponent has a single entity and you happen to net them or root them in place somehow or have them tied down, Piercing Bolts will actually destroy units such as Shaggets, Steam Tanks, and units like that very, very quickly. It's actually disgusting how much damage they can do to single entities. So the only real downside to this lore is Flamestorm, and I guess Kindle Flame isn't necessarily the most useful for your army most of the time. You can get some synergy with Flamesword of Ruin. You can get synergy with specific units like Knights of the Blazing Sun, Fireborn, Sisters of Avalorn, but really the lore is just excellent. Lore of Death, this is going to surprise some people, I suspect, but I don't think Lore of Death is that good nowadays. I think it's a pretty meh lore. I actually think it's probably a low A, if not a high B. And that might sound a little harsh or surprising, but Lore of Death really only has one gimmick, and that's Spirit Leech. And besides that, the lore's kind of eh. The passive is not bad. More Winds of Magic. Always nice. Okay, that's good. Spirit Leech, very strong for sniping single targets or cavalry. Okay, that's good. But the rest of the lore, eh. Purple Son of Zerus is okay. It's not great. Not terrible. It's a meh spell. The Soul Blight is a decent debuff. Minus 30 armor, minus 25% weapon strength, but not that great of a debuff. It's a meh debuff. The Doom and Darkness, it's okay. It's a leadership debuff. If you're looking to leadership bomb, it's a very strong spell, but it's a very niche application, and you're hoping your opponent blobs a whole bunch to really get value out of it, and you're hoping that your opponent brought a bunch of low leadership units to exploit with Doom and Darkness. It has niche applications, routing Dread Saurians out of Doom boxes and stuff, but eh. Aspect of the Dread Knight, it can help prop units up in a niche situation. If you're Beastmen and you're about to get terror routed, Aspect of the Dread Knight can counter that. Great. But it's kind of niche. It just doesn't do that much. And then Fate of Buna, yeah, it does decent damage. Or I should say it does good damage, but it's just so expensive. Winds of Magic wise and money wise. And as a result, I don't think Death is really a lore that's propped up by Spirit Leech. If Spirit Leech was a mess spell, Lore of Death would probably be a low B or even a C tier. Because I think it's just not that good of a lore nowadays. It's really Spirit Leech that props Death up. And if you're looking for a more varied and flexible lore and you're not just looking to be kind of gimmicky and spam Spirit Leech, it's not that good of a lore. And same thing with Lore of Darkness. I think Lore of Darkness is probably even worse than Death. I'm actually going to give Lore of Dark probably... This is a tough one, but it doesn't deserve a particularly high tier in my opinion either. It's a lore that's essentially, I'm going to give it a low B. It's a lore that is propped up by Soul Stealer. If it didn't have Soul Stealer, once again, this lore would probably be a C. If Soul Stealer wasn't that strong. Soul Stealer, of course, AoE, direct damage effect. That also heals the caster. Very strong. No debate there. The problem is the passive in this lore is not that good. Minus 15 armor. It's not that great because the spammy spells in this lore are not that good. So it's trying to spam that. Plus minus 15 armor isn't that good to begin with. Especially for a roster that... This is exclusive to Dark Elves, and Dark Elves are a roster that's just overloaded with AP damage, so dropping enemy armor is kind of irrelevant for most builds. But Chillwind, it's a slow, but it's not as good as Melkoth's Miasma. It doesn't do as much damage consistently, in my opinion. Easier to dodge, and it will do basically nothing to cavalry and units like that. Power of Darkness damages your own units, grants you more Winds of Magic, sure, but it also costs Winds of Magic, so the returns can be, so you can definitely experience some diminishing returns as a match progresses. Definitely not the greatest ability there. Blade Wind, I've seen a lot of people use it, but actually get value out of it. It tends to be rare. It's an okay Vortex, but it's a Vortex still. It's just not that good. The Word of Pain is an excellent single target debuff, but costs so darn much, especially to overcast and get that melee defense debuff, which is really what you want in a lot of cases, in my opinion, to get essentially an enfeebling foe effect. It just costs a crap ton. And then Doom Bolt is just too easy to dodge, and it can be used against blobbed up infantry or cav, but in my opinion, it's just not worth bringing. Soul Stealer will do that job better. So Lore of Dark is really just a B tier. is a low B at that. I don't think it's a good lore, actually. I think Soul Stealer is what props this lore up. And if it wasn't for Soul Stealer, this lore would probably be C. Finally, we do have the Big Wa. And this is a very, very, very good lore. It's basically tied with Little Wa. I think it's an excellent lore of Magic. Reasoning. Big Wa has some amazing damage spells. Gaze of Orcs isn't terrible. The Foot of Gork is amazing at deleting enemy cavalry, especially if you snared them with like a Effigy of the Git or Smoke Bomb or something like that, or you just got them caught up on like Spider Rider or something. The Brain Bursta can do decent damage to squishy units, disrupt them. The Headbutt can do decent damage and disrupt. Most importantly, Irigo and Fists of Gork are just amazing. Oh, and I should say the Power of the Wa, which is the passive, is a great way of generating extra wins of magic. But completely glossed over the passive. It's one of those no-name passives. It's one of those like generic passives like Beast or Death. But more wins of magic is always nice. But Irigo and Fist of Gork is really what makes this lore, I think. Foot of Gork, kind of. But all very, very strong spells. The buffs they can provide are amazing. I will say, okay, I will actually position this a little lower, though, than the lore of the Little Wa, because I think there are a lot of cases where you'll almost always bring Little Wa, but you won't always bring Big Wa. I think part of it is just because the spells are so expensive. Part of it is because the casters that come with this lore are more expensive. So as a result, I think it's a little lower than Little Wa, but still a very, very strong lore, and definitely would recommend it. So I know there's probably some controversial picks here. I know me putting Death of this low on the list, or Lord of Dark so low on the list, probably going to rile some people up. That's okay. I do think Lore of Plague is just head and shoulders above everybody else in this game. As you can see, I think most spells are pretty close to one another. And I think you could really make an argument for many of these. But I think there are some that just stand out in excellence or stand out in meh/nicheness. It's tough for Itza to be anywhere because it only has one type of spell, really, and it only comes on one Lord, and it's so super niche. Lore of Depths, I think, is just, or Lore of the Deep is just, I think, weak. It's a kind of crap lore. Or an explicitly subpar lore. But you guys are free to disagree. Free to leave your comments down below. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you enjoyed this breakdown of all the spells and explaining what some of their uses and potential value can be. As usual, leave your thoughts, comments, and critiques down below. And I will see you all in the next one. Wyvern out.